The cold had stolen the feeling from his fingers an hour ago, turning them into clumsy, useless things at the ends of his arms. Buried in the shallow burrow he had desperately clawed into a snow-covered riverbank, 11-year-old Caleb Josiah Brennan was no longer shivering. A dangerous stillness was creeping over him, a calm that he knew was the final whisper of death in the 20-degree below zero Minnesota wilderness. He pushed deeper into the frozen earth, a primal instinct to escape the wind that howled like a predator just outside his fragile shelter. It was then that his numb, scraping fingers struck something that didn't belong. It was hard, unyielding, and brutally cold, a solid shape beneath the dirt and roots. With a final surge of adrenaline, he dug around it, his hands raw and bleeding, until he unearthed a small, heavy metal box, its surface rough with rust. He didn't know what it was, but in that moment, it was the only other solid thing in his dissolving world. This story is a testament to the quiet resilience of the human spirit in the face of unimaginable cruelty. And if you believe that such stories need to be told, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to our channel. Every interaction helps us share these powerful narratives with more people. We would also love to know where you are listening from, so feel free to leave a comment below and become part of our community of listeners. Your support is what makes this journey possible, and we promise this is a story that will stay with you long after it ends. A reminder that hope can be found in the coldest and darkest of places, often buried just beneath the surface, waiting for a desperate hand to find it. But to understand how this small, rusted lockbox, discovered at the very edge of existence, would become the instrument of both Caleb's salvation and the downfall of the man who left him to die, we must go back 1 year. We must return to a time before the freezing forest, before the desperate burrow in the snow, to the day Caleb's world first shrank to the size of a cold, dark warehouse on the shores of Lake Superior. It was there in the oppressive shadow of his stepfather, Vernon Slade, that the chain of events was set in motion. A story not just of survival against the elements, but of a quiet, forgotten boy's fight against a cruelty far colder than any Minnesota winter. 1 year before that desperate night, Caleb Josiah Brennan was only 10 years old. His world was not the vast, indifferent wilderness, but the contained, oppressive gloom of a fur-trading warehouse in Duluth. The shift had been brutal and swift. Less than 12 months prior, he had a father, a logger, whose hands smelled of pine sap, and whose laughter echoed through the woods. Then came the felling accident, a single moment that splintered his life as cleanly as an axe splits a log. His mother had passed years before from fever. With his father gone, Caleb was left an orphan. He was taken in not out of love, but out of cold utility by his uncle and now stepfather, Vernon Slade, the husband of his mother's frail sister. He had traded the scent of pine for the smell of death and curing chemicals, and the warmth of a family hearth for the perpetual chill that blew in off Lake Superior. The warehouse was a cavern of stone and heavy timber, a place where light struggled to penetrate the grime on the high windows. The air was thick with a permanent, layered odor, the musky scent of beaver and mink pelts, the sharp tang of tanning agents, and the underlying dampness of the nearby lake. For Caleb, this was the smell of his new life. The sounds were muted, swallowed by the piles of fur and burlap. The clang of the trolley on the street outside, the cry of gulls, the distant horn of a ship, all of it felt like it belonged to another world, one he could hear, but no longer touch. His existence was confined to these four walls, a silent, grey reality where the only vibrant colours were the deep browns and blacks of the animal hides he was forced to handle from dawn until dusk. Vernon Slade was not a man of loud cruelty. His oppression was a quieter, more insidious thing. He rarely raised his voice at Caleb. Instead, he moved through the warehouse with a chilling indifference, his eyes gliding over the boy as if he were just another crate to be moved or a stack of pelts to be sorted. To Vernon, Caleb was not a nephew or a stepson. He was an asset, a piece of free labor acquired through a family tragedy. This cold disregard was more terrifying than any physical blow. It was a constant unspoken declaration that Caleb did not matter, that his presence was tolerated only as long as he remained useful. Vernon's silence was a heavy blanket, smothering any hope the boy might have harbored for kindness or recognition in his new home. Caleb's days bled into one another, marked only by the rising and setting of a sun he rarely felt on his skin. He would wake before first light on his bed of burlap sacks in a small, windowless back room, the cold from the stone floor seeping into his bones. His primary task was sorting the pelts that arrived from trappers. His small, nimble fingers, which had once learned to tie fishing knots with his father, were now perpetually stained and raw from handling the stiff, treated hides. He learned to distinguish the soft, dense fur of a beaver from the sleek coat of a river otter by touch alone, his world reduced to a series of textures. The work was endless, a mountain of fur that never seemed to shrink, and he performed it with the silent, mechanical efficiency of a boy who knew his survival depended on it. A gnawing hunger was his constant companion, a dull ache in his stomach that defined his waking hours. Meals were an afterthought, consisting of whatever scraps were left over from Vernon and Edith's table. A hardened piece of bread, a spoonful of cold stew, perhaps a withered potato, these were the meager fuels for his long days of labor. He learned to eat slowly, to make the small portions last, to trick his stomach into feeling full for a few precious minutes. The hunger was more than a physical sensation. It was a symbol of his complete and utter powerlessness. It was a daily reminder that he was entirely dependent on the whims of a man who saw him as less than human, a ghost haunting the edges of a life that was not his own. His only source of warmth in that cold world was his aunt, Edith Slade. She was a pale, bird-like woman, her health as fragile as her spirit. She moved through the house with a quiet, apologetic air, terrified of her domineering husband. But in her eyes, Caleb saw a flicker of the same kindness he remembered from his mother. Edith was his last connection to the family he had lost, a living, breathing piece of his past. She could not protect him from Vernon's coldness or the grueling work, but her silent presence was a small anchor in his turbulent new reality. She was a whisper of compassion in a world that had become brutally loud with its own indifference to his suffering. Sometimes when Vernon was away at the docks or preoccupied with his ledgers, Edith would perform small secret acts of rebellion. A thick slice of fresh bread, still warm from the oven, would be pressed into Caleb's hand as he passed her in the hallway, or a small wrinkled apple would be left for him on his pile of sacks, a treasure of sweetness in his bland existence. These moments were fleeting and fraught with risk. A shared glance was their only communication, a silent understanding that this was all she could offer. For Caleb, these tiny offerings were not just food. They were proof that he was not entirely forgotten. They were small, flickering candles of humanity that kept the utter darkness at bay. In the dead of night, when the warehouse was silent except for the scuttling of mice, Caleb would retreat into his memories. He would conjure the image of his father, a broad-shouldered man with a booming laugh, teaching him how to read the forest. He could almost feel the rough bark of a pine tree, smell the clean, sharp scent of sawdust, and hear his father's voice explaining how to find north by the stars. These memories were both a sanctuary and a source of profound sorrow. They were fragments of a life so full of love and security that it felt like a dream. He clung to them desperately, replaying them in his mind until the edges grew soft with wear, using them as a shield against the crushing reality of his present. His bed was a pile of coarse burlap sacks in a storage closet, tucked away behind barrels of salted fish. The material was scratchy against his skin, and it carried the perpetual dusty scent of the warehouse. There was no pillow, no blanket, only the thin, worn clothes he wore day and night. The cold was a physical presence in that room, a predator that stalked him in his sleep. He would curl into a tight ball, tucking his hands between his knees, trying to preserve what little body heat he had. Sleep was rarely a peaceful escape. It was a shallow, fitful state from which he would often wake, shivering, the profound loneliness of his situation washing over him in the suffocating darkness. He learned to make himself small, to become invisible. He moved through the warehouse like a shadow, his footsteps soft on the wooden floors, his voice rarely rising above a whisper. He understood instinctively that drawing attention to himself was dangerous. He kept his head down, his eyes on his work, and built a wall of quiet resignation around his heart. He did not cry or complain. He simply endured. This was not a conscious strategy, but a primal instinct for survival. He was a boy holding his breath, waiting for a danger he couldn't name but could feel gathering in the air, a tension that was slowly tightening around the foundations of his precarious life. And then a subtle change began to permeate the oppressive atmosphere of the warehouse. It was a shift in the currents of the house, a new tension that had nothing to do with the price of furs or the changing seasons. Vernon's indifference began to take on a sharper edge, his glances lingering on Caleb a moment too long, his silence growing heavier, more menacing. Edith seemed to shrink even further into herself, her eyes darting about with a new heightened fear. Caleb didn't understand the source of this change, but he felt it in his bones. The fragile, miserable stability he had known for the past year was beginning to crack, and he knew with the certainty of a wild animal sensing an approaching storm, that whatever was coming would be far worse than anything he had yet endured. The first tremor that signaled the coming earthquake in Caleb's life was not a shout or a blow, but a quiet, fragile announcement. One evening, after a meager supper, Edith Slade, her face paler than usual in the flickering lamplight, placed a trembling hand on her stomach and told her husband she was with child. There was no joy in Vernon's eyes, no warmth in his response. Instead, a stillness descended upon him, a deep and chilling quiet that was far more terrifying than any outburst of anger. Caleb, clearing the table, felt the air in the room thicken and grow cold, as if a window had been thrown open to the harsh January wind. He saw the look on his stepfather's face, a look of cold, hard calculation, and a knot of pure dread tightened in his gut. The news of a new life had, in some terrible and inexplicable way, just signed his death warrant. He didn't know how, but he knew the fragile balance of his existence had been irrevocably shattered. In the days that followed, Vernon's cold indifference began to curdle into something more sinister. The way he looked at Caleb changed. It was no longer the dismissive glance one gives to a piece of furniture, but the sharp, focused stare of a man examining a problem that needed to be permanently solved. His silence, once a heavy blanket of neglect, now felt like a coiled serpent, poised to strike. He would watch Caleb sort the pelts, his lips a thin, bloodless line, his mind clearly worlds away, plotting and scheming. Caleb felt the weight of that gaze on his back all day, a physical pressure that made it hard to breathe. The warehouse, which had always been a prison, began to feel more like a cage where a predator was slowly starving its prey, waiting for the perfect moment to move in for the kill. The subtle shift was undeniable, a change in the atmospheric pressure that foretold a violent storm. The storm broke on a Tuesday evening, 4 days after the announcement. A raw wind howled off the lake, rattling the grimy windows of the warehouse. Caleb was curled on his burlap sacks, trying to find a position that offered some defense against the drafts, when he heard the low murmur of voices from Vernon's office. It was unusual for them to speak so late. Driven by a primal need to understand the danger that now surrounded him, he slipped from his makeshift bed, his bare feet silent on the freezing floorboards. He pressed his ear against the thin wooden wall, the rough grain of the planks digging into his cheek. The cold of the wood seemed to seep directly into his skull as he strained to hear the words that would define the rest of his short life. He held his breath, his heart hammering against his ribs, a tiny, terrified witness in the suffocating darkness. Vernon's voice was the first thing he could distinguish, a low, guttural sound stripped of all warmth. He was speaking of logistics, of finances, of the cost of raising a child, their own child. And then came the words that stopped Caleb's heart. He spoke of the burden of feeding and housing an orphan, an expense they could no longer afford. He floated the idea of sending Caleb away to a workhouse in St. Paul, he said. But the tone was wrong. It was a lie, a flimsy piece of scenery set up for Edith's benefit. Caleb heard the hollow falseness in it, the casual cruelty disguised as practicality. He knew, with absolute certainty, that the workhouse was not his destination. It was a story Vernon was telling his wife and perhaps himself to justify something far, far worse. The lie was more terrifying than the truth, because it meant the real plan was too monstrous to be spoken aloud, even to his own wife. He heard Edith's reply, a sound so faint it was almost lost in the creaking of the old building. It was a whisper of protest, a fragile, pleading question. She was terrified of her husband, and her fear made her voice thin and reedy, a sound with no strength and no conviction. Her weak defense was brushed aside with a single, dismissive grunt from Vernon. In that moment, any lingering childish hope Caleb might have harbored that his aunt could protect him dissolved into dust. She was a prisoner too, trapped by her own fear and frailty. He was utterly, completely alone. There was no one to appeal to, no one to run to. The final door had just been closed and locked, leaving him on the wrong side, facing the monster by himself. The realization landed with the force of a physical blow, knocking the air from his lungs. Then Vernon's voice dropped lower, becoming a conspiratorial rasp that made Caleb's skin crawl. He laid out the real plan, the perfect solution, as he called it. He spoke of the brutal Minnesota winter as if it were a business partner, a reliable accomplice. An orphan runs away, he explained. It happens all the time. A boy, distraught and foolish, gets lost in a blizzard. Who would question it? Who would look too hard for a stray, a piece of human refuse? The authorities would file a report. There would be a perfunctory search, and then the snow would cover all traces. It was a clean, simple, and untraceable method of disposal. The words were not spoken with anger or passion, but with the chilling, detached logic of a man arranging for the delivery of goods. Caleb was not a boy to be murdered. He was a problem to be erased. The specifics of the plan were laid out with the same dispassionate clarity. On the next moonless, stormy night, when the darkness and the falling snow would provide perfect cover, he would take Caleb out into the woods. He would take the boy's boots, leaving him barefoot to hasten the work of the cold. He would tie him to a tree, just to make sure he didn't wander back toward the road. The cold would do the rest. By morning he would be found frozen. A tragic, unfortunate accident. Listening through the wall, Caleb could almost feel the phantom bite of the 20-degree below zero air on his bare skin, the rough texture of the rope on his wrists, the deep, penetrating cold stealing the life from his limbs. The abstract threat had become a detailed, meticulously planned execution. Caleb pulled away from the wall, stumbling back to his pile of sacks in a daze. His body was trembling uncontrollably, but the room no longer felt cold. A different kind of chill had settled deep in his bones, a primal terror that was absolute and paralyzing. He curled into a tight ball, wrapping his arms around his knees, but he could not stop shaking. The words he had just heard echoed in his mind, a death sentence delivered through a wooden wall. He knew there was no possibility of negotiation, no chance for escape. He was a child, trapped and powerless. The only thing he didn't know was the exact date of his own death. He lay there in the dark, listening to the howl of the wind, knowing that very soon that same wind would be his executioner. The paralysis of terror held Caleb captive for what felt like an eternity, a frozen state of mind that mirrored the inevitable fate Vernon had planned for him. He lay on the scratchy burlap, every howl of the wind outside a countdown to his own death. But deep within the terrified child, something else was stirring, a flicker of the resilience he had inherited from his father, a man who had faced down the wilderness his entire life. The chilling echo of Vernon's words, "The cold will do the rest," replayed in his mind, not as a sentence, but as a challenge. The certainty of death if he stayed began to outweigh the possibility of death if he ran. In a sudden, silent convulsion of will, the decision was made. It was not a grand, courageous choice, but a primal, desperate one. He would not wait like an animal in a trap. He would run. He would face the storm on his own terms, choosing the uncertainty of the wild over the certainty of his stepfather's murderous hands. The plan that formed in his 11-year-old mind was a fragile, desperate thing, built from fear and fragmented memories of his father's lessons. He knew he couldn't go to the town marshal. Who would believe an orphan boy's wild story against a respected businessman like Vernon Slade? He knew his aunt was a prisoner in her own home, powerless to help. The only path was out into the teeth of the blizzard Vernon was waiting for. His objective was not to reach a specific destination, but simply to disappear, to put as much distance as possible between himself and the warehouse before his absence was discovered. He would use the storm as a cloak. The very thing meant to kill him would be his only ally. He would run west away from the town and trust in the scant knowledge his father had given him about surviving in the deep woods, a knowledge that felt terrifyingly inadequate against the looming reality of a Minnesota winter. The following day, Caleb moved through his chores with a new, heightened awareness. He was no longer just a laborer. He was a spy in his own prison, studying his captor. He watched Vernon with a cold, analytical focus, noting the man's predictable routines. He saw how Vernon locked the heavy front doors at precisely 9 o'clock, how he sat with his ledgers until 10, and how the heavy tread of his boots on the stairs signaled his retirement for the night. Every detail was a potential key to his escape. He measured the silence of the house, listening for the groans of the old building, memorizing which floorboards creaked and which were safe. He was gathering intelligence, mapping the battlefield of his escape. The warehouse was no longer just a place of misery. It had become a complex puzzle he had to solve, and the price of failure was his life. His preparations were meager, almost pathetic, but they were all he had. During a moment when Vernon was shouting at a drayman outside, Caleb slipped into the pantry. His heart hammered against his ribs as his small hands found what he was looking for, a small tin of matches left on a low shelf. He pocketed it, the small, hard object feeling like a precious treasure. Later, he found a half-eaten loaf of bread, hard as a rock, left forgotten in a crate. He wrapped it in a spare rag and stuffed it deep inside his thin shirt, the rough crust scratching his skin. It wasn't enough food for a day, let alone a journey, but it was something. It was a small act of defiance, a claim on his own survival. He was no longer just accepting the scraps he was given. He was taking what he needed to live, a silent declaration of war against the man who wanted him dead. That evening, as he was clearing the supper dishes, he saw his Aunt Edith sitting by the fire, her hands resting protectively on her stomach. Her face was etched with a deep, weary sadness. And in that moment, Caleb felt a profound sense of pity for her. She was trapped just as he was, bound to a cruel man by fear and circumstance. He looked at her one last time, memorizing her pale, tired face. There was no way to say goodbye, no way to explain what he was about to do. His final glance was a silent farewell, a severing of the last tenuous link to his mother's family. As he turned away and walked back into the shadows of the warehouse, he felt the full weight of his solitude settle upon him. He was truly alone now, an orphan stepping off the edge of the world. The final signal came that night, carried on the wind. It started as a low moan around the eaves of the warehouse, then grew into a fierce howl. A moment later, the first hard grains of snow began to rattle against the high, grimy windows. The storm had arrived. This was it, the moonless, blizzard-prone night Vernon had been waiting for. A jolt of pure terror shot through Caleb, so intense it almost made him sick. The very conditions that Vernon had chosen for his murder were now Caleb's only chance for escape. The swirling snow would cover his tracks, and the roar of the wind would mask any sound he might make. It was a terrifying gamble. The storm could just as easily kill him as it could save him, but he no longer had a choice. The time for waiting was over. Lying on his burlap sacks in the suffocating darkness, Caleb was forced to confront the true magnitude of his decision. The warmth of the warehouse, however miserable, suddenly seemed like a paradise compared to the frozen hell that awaited him outside. His father's lessons about finding north and building shelters felt like children's stories against the reality of the blizzard. Doubt, cold and sharp, pierced through his resolve. What if he couldn't find shelter? What if he froze in the first hour? The sheer hopelessness of it all washed over him, and for a moment he was just a small, terrified boy again. But then he conjured his father's face, not as a sad memory, but as a source of strength. He remembered his father's simple creed: "You don't give up. You fight until you can't fight anymore." The thought was a spark in the cold, and it was enough. He waited, listening, his entire being focused on the sounds of the house. He heard Vernon's heavy footsteps on the floor above, the creak of the bed, and then, after what felt like a lifetime, the low, rumbling snore that was his signal. The house was finally asleep. Pushing himself up from the sacks, Caleb felt a cold, sharp clarity settle over him. The fear was still there, a knot of ice in his stomach, but it was now secondary to the overwhelming need to act. He clutched the matchbox in his pocket and felt the hard lump of bread against his chest. Taking a single, steadying breath, he slipped out of the storage closet and moved like a shadow toward the rear door of the warehouse, each silent footstep taking him further away from a certain death and deeper into the heart of the storm. The world shattered into frozen splinters at precisely 3 o'clock in the morning. A hand, rough and unyielding, clamped down on Caleb's shoulder, yanking him from the shallow depths of a fitful sleep. It was Vernon. There was no word of explanation, no shouted command, just the brutal efficiency of a man carrying out a task. Before Caleb's mind could fully grasp what was happening, he was on his feet. The shock of the frigid stone floorboards against his bare skin a jolt more violent than any alarm. Vernon's grip was like iron, his knuckles digging into Caleb's thin frame as he was hauled from the relative warmth of his burlap nest. In the dim moonlight filtering through a high, grimy window, Caleb saw the expression on his stepfather's face, a chilling mask of detached purpose, devoid of anger or any human emotion. This was not a punishment, it was a disposal. The cold he felt on his feet was nothing compared to the ice that flooded his veins. With a powerful heave, Vernon tore the worn leather boots and thin wool socks from Caleb's feet, tossing them aside with a gesture of finality. The act was symbolic and cruel, a deliberate stripping away of his last defense against the wilderness. He was being made vulnerable, being prepared for the cold that would claim him. Caleb was then dragged through the silent, cavernous warehouse, his bare feet stumbling on the uneven planks, the rough wood scraping his soles. He didn't struggle, not physically. Some deep, primal instinct, a legacy of his father's quiet strength, told him that resistance was futile and would only waste the precious energy he would need to survive what came next. Instead, his mind, reeling from the shock, began to work with a desperate, cold clarity. He was no longer a victim being dragged. He was a prisoner studying his executioner, observing every detail. Outside, the cold was a physical blow, a solid wall of air that stole his breath and burned his lungs. The blizzard had intensified, the wind whipping a stinging curtain of snow across the landscape. A small sleigh, harnessed to a single powerful horse, stood waiting like a hearse in the darkness. Caleb was thrown into the back without ceremony, landing hard on the cold wooden slats. As Vernon climbed into the driver's seat and cracked the whip, the sleigh lurched forward, its runners slicing through the fresh powder with a soft, hissing sound. The initial terror that had paralyzed Caleb began to recede, replaced by a strange, hyper-focused calm. He pulled his knees to his chest, his bare feet already turning a painful, waxy white, and began to chant his father's lessons in his mind. The wind carries the sound, the moss grows on the north side, the stars show the way. The words were a mantra, an anchor in the swirling chaos of the storm and his own fear. The journey felt both like an eternity and an instant. The familiar shapes of Duluth's waterfront quickly dissolved into the howling whiteout of the storm, replaced by the dark skeletal forms of trees lining the unseen road. Caleb forced himself to stay alert, to fight the creeping numbness in his body and mind. He peered through the driving snow, memorizing the shape of a peculiar split oak, the sharp bend in the road, the way the forest grew denser as they climbed into the hills. He was building a map in his head, a fragile blueprint for a return journey he knew he might never make. He wasn't just a passenger being taken to his death. He was a scout, gathering intelligence from the enemy territory. Every landmark he successfully burned into his memory was a small victory, a tiny act of defiance against the man who believed he could be so easily erased from the world. After what must have been an hour, the sleigh slowed and then came to a halt. The sudden silence was more deafening than the roar of the wind. They were deep in the forest, surrounded by towering pines that stood like silent, indifferent sentinels. The air here was colder, heavier, and utterly still, the storm's fury muffled by the dense canopy of trees. Vernon dismounted, his movements unhurried and deliberate. He walked around to the back of the sleigh and pulled Caleb out, his grip as impersonal and strong as it had been in the warehouse. The snow was deep here, reaching Caleb's knees, and the intense, searing cold that shot up his legs was unlike anything he had ever experienced. It was a pain so profound it felt like his very bones were freezing solid from the ground up. He bit his lip to keep from crying out, refusing to give his stepfather the satisfaction. Vernon surveyed the surrounding trees with the cool appraisal of a lumberman, his eyes finally settling on a thick, ancient pine set back a dozen yards from the track. He dragged Caleb toward it, the boy stumbling and falling in the deep powder, his feet now completely without feeling. They were no longer a part of him, just useless frozen weights at the ends of his legs. The world had narrowed to this single terrifying purpose, being led to a specific tree in the middle of a frozen, desolate wilderness. Caleb could feel the rough bark against his back as Vernon shoved him against the trunk. The tree felt ancient and solid, a silent witness to the cruelty about to unfold. He closed his eyes for a second, picturing his father's face, drawing on a strength that was not his own. From his coat, Vernon produced a length of thick hemp rope. He worked with a practiced, methodical efficiency, wrapping it around Caleb's thin chest and the unyielding trunk of the pine pulling the knots tight. He then took Caleb's wrists and bound them together in front of him, securing them with a separate, shorter piece of rope. As he worked, Caleb's mind, sharp with adrenaline, focused on the knots. He recognized them. They were the same tension knots his father, the logger, had taught him, knots designed to hold under immense pressure, but with a specific weakness that allowed them to be untied quickly. In the midst of his terror, a tiny, impossible flicker of hope ignited. Vernon, in his arrogance, was using the very skills of the man he had replaced to bind the son he was about to murder. It was a cruel irony, but it was also a chance. With the final knot pulled taut, Vernon stepped back to admire his work. He leaned in close, his voice a low, conspiratorial whisper that was almost swallowed by the wind. "When they find you frozen," he hissed, his breath a foul, warm cloud in the frigid air, "I'll say you ran off. No one looks too hard for a runaway orphan." The words were delivered with a finality that was meant to crush any last remnant of hope. They were not just a threat. They were a statement of fact, a declaration of Caleb's worthlessness to the world. Vernon saw him not as a child, not as a nephew, but as a piece of inconvenient refuse that the winter would neatly sweep away. Caleb met his stepfather's gaze, his own eyes dry and cold, refusing to show the terror that was screaming inside him. Vernon gave a single, satisfied nod, then turned his back on the boy and walked away without a second glance. He moved with the unburdened stride of a man who had just solved a difficult but necessary problem. Caleb watched him, a small, solitary figure tied to a tree, as his stepfather climbed back into the sleigh. The sound of the whip cracking through the cold air was sharp and final like a gunshot. The sleigh lurched forward, its bells beginning to jingle. A sound that should have been cheerful but now sounded like a funeral dirge. He watched the dark shape of the sleigh recede into the swirling snow, the single point of light from its lantern growing smaller and smaller until it was just a pinprick, and then nothing at all. The jingle of the sleigh bells grew fainter, a fragile sound fighting against the immense, crushing silence of the forest. Caleb strained to hear them, clinging to that last connection to the human world, however cruel it had been. Then the sound was gone, completely absorbed by the snow and the trees. He was alone. The sheer, absolute totality of his solitude descended upon him, a weight far heavier than the snow. There was no one coming for him. No one even knew where he was. The world had forgotten him. The wind moaned through the high branches of the pines, a long, mournful sound that seemed to be mourning his passing before it had even happened. The reality of his situation settled in with the cold, a certainty that was both terrifying and strangely liberating. Now the cold began its real work. It was no longer just a pain in his feet, but a deep, invasive presence that seeped through his thin clothes and into the core of his body. It was a relentless predator, and he was its tethered prey. A violent, uncontrollable shiver racked his small frame, his teeth chattering so hard he thought they would break. This was the beginning of the end, the body's last desperate fight to generate warmth before surrendering. He knew from his father's stories that he had very little time before the shivering stopped, before the deceptive, peaceful warmth of hypothermia would lull him into a sleep from which he would never wake. The apathetic forest, the biting wind, and the suffocating snow were all conspiring to fulfill Vernon's prophecy. But Vernon had made a critical miscalculation. He had seen a helpless orphan, a weak and disposable boy. He had not seen the son of a logger, a child who had been raised on the edge of this very wilderness and taught its secrets. As the first shiver subsided, Caleb's mind cleared. The fear was still there, a cold, hard stone in his gut, but it was no longer in control. He looked down at his bound wrists, at the familiar pattern of the tension knot. He remembered his father's voice, patient and calm, guiding his small fingers. "You don't pull against the knot, Caleb," his father had said. "You find its weakness. You persuade it to let go." With his fingers already stiffening and clumsy with cold, Caleb began to work, his teeth gritting against the pain, his mind focused on that single, impossible task, persuading the rope to let him live. His mind was a maelstrom of pain and cold, but one thought, one memory of his father, cut through the blizzard of his panic. It was the story of the Ojibwe hunters, of their winter burrows dug into the earth to borrow its deep, steady warmth. It was not a plan, but a prayer, a direction for his useless, frozen feet. He stumbled west, away from the road, away from the town, away from Vernon. Each step was an agony, his bare feet now completely numb, clumsy blocks of ice at the end of his legs. He fell repeatedly, the impact with the snow-covered ground barely registering. He was driven by a single, desperate image, a small space, shielded from the wind, a hole in the ground that might grant him another hour of life. The forest was a blur of white and black, a hostile, indifferent world that was actively trying to kill him, and he was fighting back with nothing more than a half-remembered story. After what felt like a lifetime of torturous movement, he heard it, a subtle change in the sound of the wind, a low, gurgling sound beneath the snow. A river. He pushed through a final thicket of bare-limbed birch trees and found himself on the edge of a steep, snow-covered embankment. The river below was mostly frozen, but a dark channel of fast-moving water still flowed in its center. The current had eroded the bank, carving out a concave space and exposing a thick, tangled mat of ancient tree roots. It was exactly as his father had described it. This was his only chance. He slid down the bank, the rough, icy snow tearing at his thin trousers, and landed in a heap at the base of the exposed earth. The wind was slightly less severe here, sheltered by the high bank, but he knew this small respite wouldn't be enough. He had to get into the earth itself. With hands that were no longer his own, clumsy and devoid of feeling, he began to claw at the frozen dirt between the thickest roots. The ground was as hard as iron, and his raw, bleeding fingers made little progress. He didn't feel the pain, he was far beyond it. He was a creature of pure instinct now, an animal fighting for its den. He used his entire body, throwing his weight against the frozen wall, scraping with the ragged edges of his fingernails until they were gone. The sound was a desperate rhythmic scratching, punctuated by his own ragged, gasping breaths that turned to white clouds in the frigid air. He was digging his own grave, but he prayed it would be a grave that could give him life, a temporary tomb to hide him from the storm's relentless fury until the sun could rise again. He worked until his muscles screamed, and his mind began to fog, the first tendrils of that dangerous, peaceful lethargy creeping in. Just as he felt his strength give out completely, a section of the frozen earth gave way. He fell forward into a shallow cavity, a space no larger than a coffin, but a space nonetheless. The relief was instantaneous and profound. The roar of the blizzard outside was suddenly muffled, reduced to a distant, angry moan. The direct assault of the wind was gone. It was not warmth he felt, but simply the absence of that killing wind, and it was the most beautiful sensation he had ever known. He lay there for a long moment, his cheek pressed against the cold, damp dirt, the silence in his small haven a sacred thing. It was the silence of survival, a temporary victory against the storm and against the man who had sent him into its teeth. Summoning the last of his reserves, Caleb crawled fully inside the burrow. He reached out and pulled in handfuls of snow, dry leaves, and pine needles, packing them into the entrance to further insulate his fragile shelter. This, too, was a lesson from his father. Use what the forest gives you. The space was cramped and dark, smelling of frozen earth, decaying leaves, and the faint, clean scent of pine. He curled his body into the tightest ball he could manage, tucking his frozen hands under his arms and pressing his useless feet against the back wall of the burrow. The cold was still immense, a deep and penetrating chill that had settled in his very bones, but he was no longer losing heat to the wind. Now the battle was internal, a fight against his own body as it began the slow, inexorable process of shutting down. A violent, uncontrollable shivering took hold of him, a final desperate rebellion of his muscles against the encroaching death. His teeth chattered with a painful, machine-like rhythm, and his entire body convulsed. He knew what this was. His father had warned him of it. This was the body's last fire, burning its remaining fuel in a futile attempt to stay warm. He knew that when the shivering stopped, a deceptive and deadly calm would follow, a gentle invitation to sleep from which he would never awaken. He fought the urge to close his eyes, to give in to the exhaustion that was pulling at him like a physical weight. He had to stay awake. He had to fight. He pressed himself harder against the back of the burrow, a primal instinct to get even farther away from the cold. It was in that last, desperate push for survival that his numb, scraping fingers struck something that did not belong. Buried deep in the frozen earth at the back of his burrow, there was an object. It was not a rock or a root. It was hard, unyielding, and brutally cold, with a flat surface and a sharp 90-degree corner. The sensation, even through his unfeeling fingertips, was so alien, so out of place, that it sent a jolt of pure adrenaline through his exhausted body. It was a mystery in the dark, a solid and man-made shape in a world of natural chaos. For a moment the cold and the fear were forgotten, replaced by a surge of primal curiosity. What was this thing, hidden beneath the earth in the middle of nowhere? With a final convulsive burst of energy, he dug around it. His hands were raw and bleeding, but he didn't notice. He was a man possessed, driven by the need to uncover this strange artifact. He scraped and pulled at the frozen dirt, his ragged breaths echoing in the tiny space, until he had cleared enough earth to work the object free. It was heavier than he expected, a solid, dense weight that took all his remaining strength to pull from its ancient resting place. He cradled it in his lap, the intense cold of the metal seeping through his thin trousers. He ran his clumsy fingers over its surface, feeling the rough texture of rust and the clear, rectangular shape. It was a box, a small, heavy metal box, its surface pitted and scarred by decades spent buried in the unforgiving soil. He didn't know what it was, or what it contained, or how it had come to be buried in this specific spot on a lonely riverbank. He was too cold, too tired, and too close to death to even begin to guess at its secrets. In that moment, the box was not a container of mysteries. It was simply an anchor. It was the only other solid, tangible thing in his dissolving world. He dragged it closer, pulling it against his chest, the brutal cold of the metal a shocking, grounding sensation against his skin. He clutched it with both arms as a new wave of shivering racked his body. He held onto it as if it were the last piece of a shipwreck, a solid piece of reality to cling to as the icy waters of unconsciousness rose to claim him. He fell into a state somewhere between sleep and death, his cheek pressed against the rusted metal lid of the box, his breathing shallow and faint. The blizzard howled on outside his fragile shelter, but he no longer heard it. He was adrift, a boy lost in the great, cold darkness, unaware that the object he held was not just a random piece of iron. He was holding a story, a history of violence that mirrored his own. He was holding the evidence of a forgotten crime, a secret that had been waiting patiently in the frozen ground for the desperate hands of a forgotten boy to unearth it. He was holding his salvation, the instrument of his revenge, waiting for the dawn or the end, whichever came first. The warmth of the Ojibwe lodge was a shock to Caleb's system, a gentle but overwhelming wave that seemed to penetrate deeper than the cold had. For 2 days, he drifted in and out of a fevered consciousness, his world a blur of soft deerskin blankets, the smoky scent of burning cedar, and the low, rhythmic chanting of the healer, Black Hawk. His feet were wrapped in a poultice of herbs that both burned and soothed, a strange and constant reminder of the life he had almost lost. The metal box sat on the floor beside his pallet, a silent, rusted sentinel. It had been his anchor in the storm, and now, in the safety of this lodge, it became an object of intense, almost fearful curiosity. The hunters, a man named Megizi and his son, Chaitan, regarded it with a quiet reverence, understanding that the boy and the box had been found together for a reason, their fates intertwined by the spirit of the frozen river. When Caleb was finally strong enough to sit up, his mind clear and the fever broken, Black Hawk brought the box to him. It was heavier than he remembered, a solid piece of a forgotten world. The lock was rusted shut, a stubborn seal that had held for decades. There was no key, no obvious way to open it. McGeezy brought a small hand axe and a heavy skinning knife. There was no grand ceremony, just the quiet, practical work of men who understood how to open what was sealed. With Caleb watching, his breath held tight in his chest, McGeezy carefully worked the blade of the knife into the seam of the lid, using the axe as a hammer to gently but firmly tap it deeper. The sound was sharp and metallic, a stark contrast to the soft sounds of the lodge, each strike a small explosion in the quiet air. The rusted metal groaned in protest, resisting the intrusion of the modern world. For a long moment it seemed it would not yield, that its secrets would remain locked away forever. Then, with a final, sharp crack that made Caleb flinch, the seal broke. A puff of stale, musty air escaped, carrying the scent of dry leather and something else, something ancient and sorrowful. McGeezy pried the lid back, revealing the contents nestled inside. The first thing Caleb saw was the dull gleam of gold. A small deerskin pouch, brittle with age, had split open, spilling a handful of French gold coins. They were strange and beautiful, but they held no meaning for him. He had just faced death, and the wealth of the world felt like a trivial thing, a collection of useless, shiny stones. His gaze moved past the gold, drawn to the other objects in the box. Beneath the coins lay a stack of papers, tied with a leather thong that crumbled to dust at the slightest touch. They were legal deeds. Their ink faded and the paper yellowed and fragile. The writing was a strange, flowing script he couldn't decipher, filled with names and places that meant nothing to him. The St. Louis River Company, Grand Portage, Fond du Lac. He pushed them aside gently, his fingers brushing against the final item, the one that took up most of the space within the box. It was a book, a small ledger bound in dark, cracked leather. It felt cold and solid in his hands, a repository of a life he couldn't yet imagine. The cover was bare, worn smooth by time and the pressure of the earth. This, he knew instinctively, was the heart of the mystery. This was the reason the box had waited for him. With Black Hawk's quiet encouragement, Caleb opened the diary. The pages were stiff, and the ink, a deep sepia, had bled slightly into the fibers of the paper. The first several dozen pages were written in French, a language he did not understand. But as he turned the fragile pages, the script changed. The writer had switched to a slightly clumsy but legible English, as if practicing the language of his new partners. The entries were dated, beginning in the spring of 1847. They were the mundane records of a fur trader named Jean-Luc Dubois. He wrote of the price of beaver pelts, the harshness of the winter, the beauty of the lake, and his dealings with the local Ojibwe, whom he described with a respect and admiration that felt startlingly familiar to Caleb. He was reading the words of a man who had walked this same land, felt this same cold, and seen the same stars. As Caleb read deeper into the diary, a name appeared that made the blood freeze in his veins: Slade. Jean-Luc Dubois wrote of his new American business partner, a man named Elias Slade, who had recently arrived from the East. He described Elias as ambitious and clever, a man who knew how to make money but who seemed to lack a fundamental warmth. A chill crept up Caleb's spine as he read the words. He was reading about Vernon's grandfather. The diary was no longer just a historical record. It was a piece of his own story, a prequel to the nightmare he had just endured. He felt a strange and powerful connection to this long-dead Frenchman, a sense of shared experience that transcended the 42 years that separated their lives. Both of them had been drawn into the cold orbit of the Slade family, and he knew with a dreadful certainty that Dubois' story would not end well. The entries for the fall of 1847 grew more cautious. Dubois wrote of disagreements with Elias Slade, of money that had gone missing, of trapping routes that had been secretly sold to competitors. He described a growing sense of unease, a feeling of being watched, of being isolated. He wrote of his decision to dissolve the partnership and take his share of the gold and the deeds, to start his own trading post further west. He had buried his diary and his assets in this box by the riverbank, a place he considered sacred and safe, intending to retrieve it in the spring. He trusted the land more than he trusted his partner. The words were a chilling echo of Caleb's own isolation, the same dawning realization that the man who was supposed to be a partner was, in fact, a predator. Then came the final entry, written in a hurried, slightly shaky hand. It was dated November 10th, 1847. Jean-Luc Dubois wrote that Elias Slade had come to him, feigning reconciliation. He had proposed one last trip into the woods together, to scout a new line of traps before the heavy snows came. Dubois was suspicious, but Slade had been persuasive. The final lines of the diary were a frantic, desperate scrawl, as if written in the final moments of his life. He described how Elias had led him deep into the forest, to a place not far from the river, and how, without a word, his partner had turned on him with a knife. The last sentence was unfinished, a trailing line of ink that spoke of a life cut short. "He means to kill me and take it all," Dubois had written. "He thinks no one will ever know, but the earth knows, the river knows. I leave this truth in their keeping." Caleb closed the book, his hands trembling. The words on the page were not just an account of a murder. They were a mirror. The same name, the same greed, the same method. A betrayal in the wilderness, leaving a man to the mercy of the elements, believing the crime would be swallowed by the vast, indifferent landscape. Vernon was not an anomaly. He was the inheritor of a legacy of violence. The evil that had tied him to that tree was a family tradition, a darkness passed down from grandfather to grandson. The realization was staggering, a blow that left him breathless. He was not just a random victim of a cruel man. He was the latest chapter in a story of greed and murder that had begun 4 decades earlier. The cold of that night had not been a random act of cruelty, but the echo of an original sin. A single hot tear traced a path through the grime on his cheek, then another and another. He wasn't crying from fear or from pain, but from a profound and overwhelming sense of connection. He was crying for Jean-Luc Dubois, the man who had died alone in the snow, his story buried and forgotten. He was crying because, in a way he could not fully comprehend, this man had reached across 42 years of frozen silence to save him. Dubois had entrusted his story to the earth, and the earth, in its own time, had delivered it into the hands of the one person who would understand it. He had not been alone that night. The ghost of another victim had been with him, guiding his fingers to the one place where the truth lay waiting. He looked at the hunters, at Black Hawk, his vision blurred by tears. He tried to speak, to explain the magnitude of what he had found, but no words came. He could only hold the diary to his chest, clutching it as he had clutched the box in the burrow. It was more than evidence, it was a testament. It was proof that he mattered, that his life had value, because it was now inextricably linked to the task of bringing a long-buried truth to light. The gnawing hunger, the cold indifference, the feeling of being worthless, all of it began to wash away, replaced by a new, unfamiliar sensation. It was the feeling of purpose. Vernon Slade had tried to erase him, to make him a forgotten footnote in the snow, but the earth had given him a voice, and it was the voice of a man who had refused to be silenced, even in death. The journey back to Duluth was a silent, somber procession. Caleb rode on a sled pulled by McGeezy's dogs, the metal box resting in his lap, the diary tucked safely inside his coat. He was no longer a runaway orphan fleeing for his life. He was a witness, an instrument of a justice that had been delayed for nearly half a century. When they arrived at the federal marshal's office, the sight of the town no longer filled him with fear. The power that Vernon Slade had held over him was broken, shattered by the truth contained in a dead man's book. The marshal, a stern man with a weary but honest face, listened to the boy's story with growing astonishment, his eyes moving from Caleb's still bandaged feet to the rusted box on his desk. He read the final entry of the diary himself, his expression hardening into a mask of cold fury. The arrest of Vernon Slade sent a shockwave through the city of Duluth. He was not just a businessman, he was a pillar of the community, a man whose family name was synonymous with the town's prosperity. But the evidence was undeniable. The diary, the deeds, the French gold coins, they told a story that could not be refuted. The investigation into the long, cold case of the missing French trader, Jean-Luc Dubois unearthed a pattern of corruption and intimidation that stretched back for decades. Vernon's crime was not an isolated act, but the culmination of a family's dark history. Faced with the diary and with the testimony of a boy who had survived the very fate intended for him, Vernon's facade of respectability crumbled into dust. He was tried not just for the attempted murder of Caleb, but for the legacy of crimes upon which his fortune was built. The trial was swift. The jury saw in Caleb not a lying orphan, but the living embodiment of the Slade family's cruelty. Vernon Slade was found guilty and sentenced to hang, his name forever stained by the truth that a half-frozen boy had clawed from the earth. The proud Slade legacy, built on a foundation of stolen gold and a murdered man's dream, was utterly and irrevocably destroyed. Caleb watched the proceedings with a quiet, solemn detachment. It was not about revenge, it was about balance. It was about the earth finally giving up its dead and demanding an accounting. The revelation of her family's history shattered Edith Slade. The woman who had been a prisoner of fear was horrified to learn she was the beneficiary of a murder. In an act of profound atonement, she took what remained of the family's legitimate assets and devoted them to raising Caleb. When her own son was born 6 months later, he was not a rival but a brother. Caleb was no longer an orphan, no longer a burden. He was a son, raised alongside his new half-brother in a house cleansed of its violent past, a house where kindness was no longer a secret, rebellious act, but the guiding principle of their new life. He had a family again, one forged not from convenience, but from the ashes of a terrible truth. Caleb grew into a young man, his father's quiet strength now tempered by a wisdom far beyond his years. He did not turn his back on the wilderness that had almost claimed him. Instead, he embraced it, becoming a fur trader himself. But he conducted his business with an integrity that was a direct repudiation of the Slade legacy. His primary partners were the Ojibwe who had saved his life, and his reputation for fairness and honesty became known throughout the territory. He built his own fortune not on betrayal, but on respect, proving that a life of decency was not only possible but profitable. He transformed the tools of his oppression into instruments of his own success, reclaiming the work that had once been his servitude. At the age of 24, he married Layla, Black Hawk's granddaughter, a woman who possessed her grandfather's quiet wisdom and a spirit as resilient as the northern pines. Their union was more than a marriage. It was the weaving together of two histories, a bond between the boy who was saved and the people who had saved him. They built a life on the shores of Lake Superior, raising their children with stories not of murder and greed, but of survival, justice, and the enduring power of human connection. The metal box sat on the mantel of their hearth, not as a grim reminder of the past, but as a symbol of the unlikely providence that had governed his life. Caleb never forgot the feeling of the cold, the bite of the wind, or the suffocating darkness of that January night. The scars on his feet were a permanent map of his journey. But the memory was no longer a source of terror. It had been transformed into a foundation, a bedrock of gratitude and purpose. He understood that while one man's cruelty could leave a boy to die in the snow, the kindness of strangers, the wisdom of a father, and the long-buried truth of another man's life could combine to give him a reason to live. The wilderness had been his intended tomb, but it had become his sanctuary, the place where he lost everything and in the process found the truth that would set him free.